Well, since the recording started, I'm going to go ahead and just kind of lay out what I was thinking about for tonight's conversation and just how we typically work with the framework sessions. We'll see who else joins us. But this also is the first time that we've recorded one. While it's been requested many times, we've held back from recording them in the past, partly because we want to be sure that we can be vulnerable in our conversations, open with one another, and the fact that it's recorded won't hold back from asking questions that maybe we wouldn't normally ask in public, and that we're willing to admit the things that we don't know, and we're able to seek the truth rather than feel that everything that we say we need to defend and always stand by. The principle of grace and tolerance is something that I believe in, and has been talked about quite a bit within the Forward Party, which, while we don't require everyone who joins these calls and conversations to be with the Forward Party, that is where this all started, and why we have these sessions. This is an opportunity to get together and discuss whether it be policy or challenging issues, and identify different things that might be a priority that we would ask for people to address when there are elected representatives, whether that be in our local communities or in our states or at a higher level. But even to try to understand differing perspectives and diversity of thought, and be able to respect and appreciate where other people are coming from, so that as we're working towards solutions, we can be more sympathetic and empathetic, and rather than staying in our own corner where we're putting up walls and of divisiveness and hate, we can try to really find ways to get something done and move forward towards solving problems. So that was kind of the inspiration for having these sessions, and appreciate everyone being here. The topic that I wanted to bring for conversation tonight was about mental health. Many other topics end up liking to point the finger at mental health, almost as an escape hatch. It's a very real issue, and something that has not always been handled the best way. And there's a lot of dancing around the issues, and people who, with the biggest hearts and high educations, often don't know truly how to handle this topic. And I'm not coming at you as any sort of expert. I will say I've had a number of situations in my own life with friends where this has been a very real struggle, and where intervention has been necessary. In my workplace, there have been a number of times where we've seen issues. I work in a pay what you can cafe currently, and so certainly there's people who come in that their life circumstances have led to additional mental health issues, and vice versa, where their mental health issues have led to some difficult life circumstances. I have a family member currently that's going through a bit of a challenge, a very real difficult situation, where she's not been fully diagnosed, but is suspected to have some schizophrenia diagnosis, and has made people feel unsafe at times. And the question is, and the question that I was having with some of my family members over the past week is, what are we doing about it as a nation? What are we doing about it? There's the question of what a family should do and what friends should do. There's the question about what we should expect as far as services, and what we should expect both at a local level, but at a state level and a federal level, to help people to get the help that they need, and to remove the stigma around mental health, and make sure that those who are surrounded by these people can also feel safe as these situations are being identified and also addressed. So I'm bringing this topic to all of you and saying I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you see going right, what you would ask for from your elected officials, and also what lessons have we learned from the past that we know we want to avoid. And I'll start it off with that piece. There was a lot of very aggressive treatment where mental health issues and psychotic diagnoses were, there was over medication and lobotomies and isolation, a lot of practices where certainly people were treated inhumanely, and we can easily say that things went wrong, and in a response to that was shutting down those institutions. And now I've had many conversations with people where they say the lack of those institutions is contributing to some of the problems that we see other places today when it comes to violence or homelessness, and even the relationships between authority and their communities. So institutionalism has been certainly demonized and well-deserved, in my opinion. And yet there seems to be a need on what we should be doing beyond what the current thing is. So that's my invitation to conversation tonight, and would love to hear official thoughts from anyone. If you want to comment, any thoughts that came to mind as I just introduced the topic.
So ended up staying with it, making a play, second out of the year. Levis is not playing.
There is a bit of background noise coming in from someone's microphone. I'm not sure exactly where that is. It might be yours, Earl. But okay. So within our own state, we have a state senator who just recently took his position back in the government. Or, I mean, he just recently went back to work after taking a break because he recognized that he was going through some things personally. And there's people who are saying, well, he shouldn't be in a position of leadership if he's having those challenges. And there's other that are celebrating his boldness to get the help that he needed, and to be able to come back to work after getting the help or assistance that he needed. Maybe that's an easier entry point into the conversation. Does anybody want to comment on it if they're either celebrating or struggling with John Fetterman and what he's publicly done, and how we might learn from that or have conversations with people about mental health just based on his own actions?
In my mind, just as a little bit of an intro, I think that as a very baseline, before you worry about anything else, you have to make people feel comfortable about sharing the issues that they're facing. Because if you don't do that, at least in my experience, things always end up far worse. And I think the first step to making people feel comfortable is obviously reducing stigma around something. And so I think it's very important that when somebody or when a mental health issue arises, that person is supported. I think in some cases, it might be that there would have to be a permanent change. But if somebody needs time to deal with something, then in my opinion, you have to give them that. Otherwise, in the future, people won't say that they need time, and you'll end up with a far worse result.
No, thank you for chiming in, and I appreciate what you're saying there. I agree, and I know that this is a vulnerable subject. This is tough to dive into here, because I think all of us have had at some level some internal struggles. It's very personal, either individually or with people that are close to us. So it's hard to talk about this subject without it feeling too personal, and yet we need to know what it is that we should be asking for from those who serve us in government. And I do agree with what you're saying, Jazz, is by normalizing getting help and being willing to identify that there's things out there that challenge us, um, that should be a healthy thing. I know that this is one of the conversations that often comes up around gun violence and the gun control conversations is, well, stop blaming the guns. We all know there's a mental health problem. Well, what are we doing about the mental health problem then if you want to use that defense? And it's a whole separate conversation that I don't want to go down. Tonight we can revisit the gun conversation many times in the future, and hopefully we can make progress. We've had that conversation a couple times deeply here, but I do think that that's just another example of how it's an important time to see where getting help for mental health shouldn't be attached to the same stigma as you no longer are eligible to own a gun. Without going deep into the gun conversation, that is one of the challenges that I've heard people make about red flag laws, that people don't get the help that they need because they fear that their right is going to be removed from them. So, how do we encourage help? How do we normalize getting help? One of the things I've shared before, that part of my path to getting involved with the Forward Party was through Andrew Yang's campaign. One of the things that was in his platform, because he had a very robust platform, where he listed out, I can't remember exactly how many policies were on his homepage. But one of the things that he said is that he was going to, personally, if he would get the office of the presidency, he was going to require himself to have mental health visits. And he thought that that should be required of everyone serving high office. And by doing that, part of his goal, because he would give a write out on what the expectation or what the result should be expected to come out of that. It was the idea of normalizing help and making sure that we're preventive care is also something there. He said, this is a stressful job. And by getting ahead of this and planning for that kind of support and demonstrating to other people that it's okay to get support, that that's not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength, that's a positive thing. So that's an example of where, to go along with what you said, helping to demonstrate the positive side of mental health rather than it being a negative or something that creates a stigma.
I'm reminded of our conversation that we had that was very interesting, talking about Veterans Affairs and specifically the issues that combatants faced after returning to civilian life. And in that conversation, I think we touched on a lot of these points, and we also tied it in with homelessness and other issues. And specifically, one of the points that I think was brought up a number of times was the lack of community, or the fact for those people, they didn't have people. Generally, if they went downhill, they didn't have people that they felt that they were able to reach out to, or that were supporting them. And so obviously that's something that's doesn't directly, like, I don't know what policy directly influences that from the governmental level, because that's a very much societal thing. But I think that's always something to keep in mind.
No, so part of what comes to mind as you say that is one of our pillars or principles is thriving communities. And one of the reasons why it's so important to create a thriving community would be that inclusive community where everyone feels connected and has support and doesn't feel judged when they're getting help. All of that is part of what we need. And yes, I agree with you. That was part of that was a great conversation that Bill helped to lead about the veterans. And another great example where there certainly is an existing stigma over the help. And there's certainly some tools that could help with specifically PTSD. We talk about the different therapeutic and treatment opportunities, especially with psilocybin and things that if we talk more about those and what they really accomplish as far as a medical treatment, that also opens up the avenue for conversation about it's okay to get treatment. And allowing that conversation to go beyond just the like medical marijuana. There's a great deal of good that's been accomplished through the decriminalization and even legalization in some states, and certainly with the prescriptive use. And I think that the way that that has influenced things, we can learn from those conversations quite a bit. But we could also be more intentional about how do we connect the dots to the treatment and what treating something with marijuana versus other pain medications. What good can be accomplished? What are the long-term effects of having someone treat pain with marijuana versus an opioid? And have we even gotten to see the long-term effects of that yet? We're kind of on that opioid wave still, where a lot of people that had been introduced and got addicted through different painkillers, and a lot of that had infiltrated our pain treatment system. But following that same trajectory and looking at what other mental health treatments, how we could introduce the conversation and look at more robust care. So as you guys can tell, there's a lot of different directions that this conversation could go, because we're talking about what we're asking for from the government to address current needs for people who are already impacted significantly. We're talking about reducing the stigma so that people, before they get to that serious impact level, might be encouraged to get help. We're talking about thriving communities and building ways to help people connect and feel connected so that they feel more stable and more connected before they even accelerate into those other areas. And there's many other ways to attack this conversation. But I'd love to hear if there's any other thoughts from Ryan or Ben, or I'm thinking is that Chelsea? I'm not sure. Earl, do you have?
Sorry.
Yes.
This this may be a foolish question, and it'll certainly show my lack of knowledge about mental health, but has it ever worked? And if so, when? How far back do we have to go to look at a time where we didn't have the kind of challenges we have today? And if that ever existed, how did it work? I don't know the answer. So I'm sorry to ask it, but that's my curiosity.
That's actually, in my mind, a very interesting question.
It is a great question, and I think that there's some anthropologists and sociologists that would love a crack to answer that. I can give my own amateur philosopher kind of viewpoint, but it's not. I'm certainly not wearing the moderator's hat or the forward chairman's hat. What if I'm going to dive into that topic? But here I want to give my opinion. I think that there was a time when communities were smaller, when people felt connected and part of a community. We looked at the tribal cultures as being uncivilized, and yet there's probably a whole lot that we can learn from the way that they interacted and where people had a role, and their role was simply to be, and they weren't striving or being put under pressure to meet certain requirements just to eat. And when we decided to put our food under lock and key and put basic security, basic needs as something that had to be earned, that changed things. So we can look at the uncivilized life of living in a hut and having to hunt for your food in a very negative way, and yet there was probably a different mental state or mental health that came with living in that kind of way. Now, that might be just an idealist viewpoint, or I might be romanticizing it. I'm sure I am, but that's what I look at when I think about a healthier mental time.
I would like
I
to
think
I like to point out that a lot of the facilities for mental health uh, have a problem with getting blocked by members of the community who just don't want them in their backyard, really. The NIMBY movement, because like a halfway house for for the mental, that for the people who may not, who need a structure for mental health reasons, but they can't be on their own. A lot of people in their community might try to block that because they don't want it, in their neighborhood. And we need to be cognizant of uh, this is a type of, there's a land use facet of this issue that we,
So there is a fear of those who need mental health support, which then creates that stigma. I mean, there's a cyclical thing kind of going on there where people push back against getting help because they understand there's a stigma. And then it kind of leads to a degradation, which creates a relationship of fear between these people who need help in the community, to where the community doesn't want them anywhere near them. Yeah. So, I like to be solution based, and yet I think that this is a conversation that's going to need revisited, and that tonight we can stay on just trying to understand and talking about a topic that I think it's so easy, like I said, just to point to mental health and walk away after saying that, because it's for many different reasons. But that's a great point that you just made there, Ben, and trying to encourage people to find ways to invite some level of treatment or care into their own communities. If they don't like a halfway house, then redefine what a halfway house looks like and make it something that you're willing to have, so that you can offer some support and give people a place to go. That's kind of what my answer would be to that, and yet that is a full-time job to figure out what that looks like, and then try to get that done.
in my mind, there's sort of two sides to this. You have the side of trying to solve problem prevention, or which is essentially going back and looking at people that are already struggling and trying to help them, which is obviously very important. But I think another just as important side is you can also look at, which is the whole field of positive psychology, the areas that are doing well, and then ask why they're doing well, and try to encourage more of that. So I pulled up, and I don't know if we want to go this way, just a list of the happiest countries in the world, which is just a great example of different places and that have vastly different levels of mental health challenges. And top countries here are Finland, Denmark, and Iceland, which are all sort of in that Nordic region. But one of the points I think would obviously be that in those regions, going back to the idea that basic necessities are required, you do have a much stronger support network from the government. Now, they're also very rich countries, so you're not in the same position, but
No, that happiness index is, and different reports on that, is something that I've pulled up a few different times in different conversations. But yeah, that's a great point that you make there. And yes, those basic needs, whether that be healthcare, affordable housing, access to food, finding the right way to deliver those. Well, now how do we do that without insulting the people who want to make sure that we don't become, a country just of handouts, or where people are dependent on the government, right? So that's the struggle, is giving people incentive to contribute and be part of their community. And I think that the pushback there, when people get so grounded in that thought, they almost create more dependence, because people almost give up. The costs they get to a level where people feel like they can never get there. Since I'm not going to achieve, I'm just going to coast. When people truly believe they can achieve, they're driven to try. Which is one of the arguments that people make for UBI. The idea that a universal basic income would give people a ground floor, as long as it's done at a level that still incentivizes people, and people gain the reward of doing work and putting effort in. I mean, that conversation is one that I think is very much alive, and it's important to look at. I think that we can put that on the list of possible contributing solutions, and yet I don't want to take the time of going too deep into that tonight. I think it's still a very divisive issue.
um, I have a lot of different things on this, just because mental health is something that's been very prescient, particularly in my age range, because I think that a lot of people are more open about their struggles, but also going through COVID at a young developmental age, and having the whole social media and internet experience has caused a lot of harm, or many effects, to my particular generation. And so I'm always thinking about this. Another point or thought that I would have is that this ties in very much to education and how people are educated. And we talked about drive and making sure that people believe they can achieve something and are still trying to work towards something. And in my mind, one of the places that really starts is if they have support at a young age, and if they're given the capabilities needed at a young age.
That's a great point. You're making lots of great points here, Jess. You're going to have to put a nice little presentation together for us with tie your points together, and from that we can help to build something actionable. that we could present and challenge our officials with, as far as how do we really get somewhere when we talk about solving the mental health crisis. But you did point to something there that certainly the social media, the fact that we're living in the digital age and artificial intelligence is this next wave of that we all expected was coming, and it's very much here now. How do we have a healthy relationship with technology and with social media and now with AI, and make sure that that doesn't further contribute to degradation with mental health? Right. We can ask the question. I don't know that anybody has exactly the answer on that yet. I think there's a lot of people that are working on solving that problem. I think awareness of it being a problem is starting to get there. There's more and more people recognizing that, yes, this all is an issue. And certainly is impacting everyone, but especially your age and your generation, Jazz. Yeah. Personally, I think that connection with making sure we make room and time for human connection, to supplement what we're doing digitally, is important. And then also, for me, what's been very healthy and my happy place is having that connection also with nature. There's nothing like sitting, for me, finding a place in the middle of the woods where I can sit down next to rushing water and listen to that water go across the rocks is my therapy session. And not to say that that alone is enough. I wouldn't say to somebody, instead of seeing a therapist, go do that. But I think to incorporate some time in nature. I think also exercise is another one of those things that can be very therapeutic and very healthy. And yet, when we start to put unrealistic goals on ourselves or make it a competition in how we exercise, it can become stressful instead of healthy. So with everything, I think our approach and the way that we teach things, we've taken on this mindset of maximum gain. Even the capitalism that we celebrate here in America, and this is driven by the stock market, is the idea of maximum returns. And that's very different than a healthy return. And I am personally speaking, this is not forward party, this is personally speaking, I am all about a capitalism of healthy competition where people are rewarded for their hard work and healthy gains are attained. And those healthy gains should be partnered with a responsibility to the community, and you're willing to sacrifice maximum gains for the greater good. Right now, I think people justify to their shareholders or stockholders their contributions to community efforts because it's going to create a return on investment. And I don't think that everything having a return on investment is absolutely the best way to go. But that mindset has transferred from the economic world and everything that we talk about as far as how to function in good business and all of the storylines and the movies that we watch and everywhere else that we look at on how to maximize at all times. And we've transferred that onto our expectations of ourselves, where we want to maximize our day. And we want to make sure that, if we have kids, maximizing their time and making sure they're plugged into a sport and an activity from the time that they get out of bed until the time they go to sleep. We're keeping one another busy and making best use of our time and multitasking even. And we've celebrated all of these things when sometimes just sitting next to the creek and listening to the water is the healthiest place to be, right? So, but that is a mindset, it's a cultural thing. How does that tie into our expectations of governance. Is there anything that can be done? And for those of you who might have a religious background, I think that this was part of the message in the story that's shared right at the beginning of the Bible in Genesis, when, on the seventh day, God rested. I think that there's an important message there that we've learned to skip over, where we take that lightly. We think about honoring the Sabbath, but we don't think about honoring time down for ourselves. Sometimes, even for those who are religious minded, that's extra pressure because of the things that they have to do to honor their religion, rather than recognizing that as an example of taking rest. So when I was young, and I'm sure Earl remembers this, I'm not sure if anybody else is old enough to remember the blue laws, where on Sundays you could barely find anything open. You better not have to go to the grocery store or do any shopping. You weren't. I mean, it's still, I think the only blue law that I know of that continues to today is not buying cars. As far as I know, around here, all the car lots are still closed. But it used to be the only businesses that were open were restaurants, and even not all of them were.
Chick-fil-A.
Chick-fil-A honors that today. Yeah. But Earl, you remember the days where almost everyone honored that.
Oh, yes.
Businesses were closed.
Yes.
And I think because it was viewed as a religious thing rather than as a mental health thing, people fought against that because they felt like somebody else was imposing their religion. And this is a great example of where, just because we don't have to get there for the same reasons, people can honor the Sabbath and respect the day of rest for whatever reason they choose. We can all see and embrace the good of that. Now, don't misinterpret or misapply what I'm saying here. I'm not suggesting that we should close businesses on Sundays, but I do think that there's the lesson to be learned there, and maybe there's a way that we can be inspired to include that example for our kids and how we schedule their time, or other ways in how we lead within our workplaces or within our other organizations, making sure that people have that personal time.
For many, many years, the church defined acceptable behavior and what was expected of citizens. Not anymore. So that I don't know if that contributes to mental illness or simply takes away a viable solution. But I would say it's a factor. For what it's worth.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that very much, and I do recognize that struggle. And I know people who are very tied into their religious communities, and I know people who very much push against religious communities. And I believe in those groups have a whole lot more in common than they don't, much like in the political world. And when we can get to the point of respecting those who feel differently, for me, when I have those conversations with someone, because I grew up in a very religious home and quite schooled in a lot of the Christian faith, but I'm not going to be the one to sit in judgment seat. For those who are religious, God is the one who's supposed to make that decision, and it's not my job to judge. The commission that I was given was to love, and so I'm going to try to respect people and appreciate who they are and meet them where they are. That's a whole religious debate that people have on where we're supposed to hold others accountable, and what we should tolerate or not. But for me, that's been part of how I viewed that and try to incorporate, because I see healthier results. I have a greater appreciation for various people and various perspectives that spills over into many different parts of my life and has rewarded, you know, there's been good fruit, to make another religious reference there. For those who know about a good tree bears good fruit and bad tree bears bad fruit. And when you're willing to be gracious with one another, I think it bears good fruit.
I think just in this conversation so far, we've outlined the fact that religion tied, not religion, mental health and religion, tie into so many different things. So with mental health, we can talk about the way we work ourselves, and we can talk about why we work ourselves like that, and we can talk about what people have, whether their living requirements are being met. I think there's so many different pieces to mental health, and so outlining, at least in my mind, one strategy related to one thing is very important. But in reality, we could break this up into outlining what each piece could do. So what can education do differently to better help people's mental health? What can we think about personally to better input our mental health? I think those are all tied into the same thing and are all important aspects that can be sort of broken off and explored.
And so with every topic, to remember that mental health is connected to all of them. The way that we approach, whether it's economics or affordable housing, or I can't think of a topic off the top of my head that would challenge me to say that there's a mental health component to it. I think most of the decisions that we're making, most of the things that we advocate for or against, there's probably a mental health component. And so by helping to bring to the forefront of these conversations what that mental health impact is and how do we improve and make our communities stronger by recognizing the impact on mental health as we're making these other decisions. Because while we might see a direct result from this policy over here, we need to think about the ripple effects and how it might be working against us because of the mental health impact. And so it's a checks and balance part of policy. When we think, if we, and this ties back into the not in my own backyard, Ben, you know, if you want to be truthful about building a beautiful community, it needs to be something that is, you know, incorporated and included at some level with all of those conversations.
I think it's also important to note that we were talking about maximum benefit versus healthy benefit, or like return. I think another way I think about that is also the long term versus the short term, because you can keep going and you can keep trying to go at an unsustainable pace, and maybe focus on one piece and try to pull as much return as you can out of that. But just based off of organizations, that doesn't work over the long run. You can get so much out of that at the short run, but if you neglect those other areas that are supposed to support just a business, for example, it'll wind up hurting you in the long run. You just think of if there is no focus on the community and all the focus is on making money, on one business is just focusing on that, and there's nobody else that's worrying about who's going to work in that business 20 years down the line, and how they're going to be thinking, you're going to see large negative effects in the future.
Are you familiar with long-termism as an actual?
Yes, I read the book.
Okay. Yeah. I was going to say, if you're not, you're very aligned with what you just said there. Yeah. Good. Well, I think this has been a good kind of unpacking of the mental health topic, and something that we can revisit maybe in a few weeks on a more focused component of it. So one of the sections that we unpack tonight, we can maybe prepare and do a little research for, maybe find someone to come in and speak on, and revisit a little further. So any other thoughts or closing comments? That I don't want to leave anybody with something unsaid, if there was something that you wanted to contribute before we end tonight. No. All right.
Thank
Well,
you for leading
thank you.
us.
Yeah, thank
Very
you.
nice.
Thank you. Good to see you. Have a good night.